sick to death after a long period of torture and agony. When they finally untied me and I was permitted to sit, I felt as if the senses were leaving me. I was in the hands of the Spanish Inquisition, a harsh panel of judges, and I heard my tormentors give me the sentence of death. After that, the sound of voices merged into one dreamy hum. The tall candles in the room sank into nothingness. Their flames went out completely. Darkness overwhelmed me, and all my sensations seemed to be swallowed up in the mad rushing descent. Then silence, stillness, and night were all I knew. I had fainted, but kept some sense of where I was and what was happening. I have memories, mere shadows of memories, that tell me I was being carried down, and further down by tall, silent figures. Very suddenly, motion and sound came back to my soul, the sound of my heart beating. Then a pause, in which all was blank. Then again sound and motion, and a touch, a tingling sensation all over. Then the mere consciousness of existence, without thought, a condition that lasted a long time. Then very suddenly, thought and shuddering terror and earnest efforts to understand where I was and what my fate was. Then a strong desire to fall into unconsciousness again. Then a rushing revival of soul and a successful effort to move. Then came a full memory of the trial, of judges, of the deep black tapestries, of the tall candles, of the sentence, of the sickness, and of the swoon. So far I had not opened my eyes. I felt that I lay on my back, unbound. I reached my hand out, and it fell upon something damp and hard. There I left it for many minutes, while I tried to imagine where and what that thing could be. I could not bring myself to look. I dreaded my first glance at the objects around me. Finally I opened my eyes, and my worst thoughts were confirmed. The blackness of eternal night surrounded me. The intensity of the darkness oppressed me and made it hard to breathe. I lay quietly and tried to think. Once I remembered that I had been sentenced by the Inquisition, I tried to understand my real condition. Had I been sent to the dungeon to await a public execution, which would not take place for many months? This, I realized at once, could not be the case. Anyone sentenced to death by the Inquisition was executed immediately. Moreover, the dungeon that I'd been in before, as well as the Inquisition death cells, had stone floors and had allowed at least some light. This cell did not. A fearful idea now sent blood rushing to my heart. For a brief period I passed out again. Upon recovering, I tried to get to my feet at once, trembling all over. I thrust my arms wildly above and around me in all directions. I felt nothing, yet I was afraid to move a step, for fear that I would find myself trapped inside the walls of a tomb. Perspiration burst from every pore and stood with big, cold beads upon my forehead. The agony of suspense grew unbearable, so I cautiously moved forward with my arms extended and my eyes straining from the sockets in hopes of catching some faint ray of light. I took several paces, but still all was dark blackness and emptiness. I breathed more freely. It seemed that I had not been buried alive. Had I been left in this world of darkness to die of starvation? Or was an even more fearful fate awaiting me? Either way, I knew too well that the result would be my death, and the bitter death at that. It was only a question of when and how. My outstretched arms finally met the solid wall, very smooth, slimy, and cold. I followed it around, stepping with careful distrust. I had heard about the traps and tricks that the Inquisition plays upon its prisoners. I could not tell how large the cell was. I tore off a piece of my rough robe that I'd been wearing and jammed the fragment into a cranny of the wall. I could not fail to meet this rag after making one complete trip around the cell. So I thought, but I had not counted on the great size of the dungeon, or on my weakness. The ground was moist and slippery. I staggered onward for some time. Then I stumbled and fell. My fatigue made it impossible for me to get up, so sleep soon overtook me. Upon waking and stretching forth an arm, I found beside me a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water. I was much too exhausted to wonder about this. I just ate and drank eagerly. Shortly afterward, I resumed my tour around the prison, and with much toil came at last upon the fragment of cloth. After counting my paces, I guessed that the dungeon was 50 yards around, and had met my angles in the wall. However, I could not begin to guess about its shape or shape of the vault. I knew that all this research had no point, but curiosity made me keep going. Leaving the wall, I decided to cross the room. At first, I walked with an extreme caution. The floor, though made of solid material, was coated with slime. After a little while, however, I took courage and began to step firmly. I wanted to cross in as direct a line as possible. After taking about 10 or 12 paces in this manner, my legs became entangled with the torn edge of my robe. I fell violently on my face. In the confusion of the fall, I did not immediately understand how lucky I had been. My chin rested upon the slimy floor of the prison, but my lips and the upper portion of my head were touching nothing. At the same time, my forehead seemed bathed in a clammy mist, and a peculiar smell of decayed fungus hit my nostrils. I put my arm forward and shuddered to discover that had I fallen at the very brink of circular pits. I could only guess its depth. I loosened a small rock from the floor and dropped it into the pits. For many seconds I listened to hear it strike something. At last there was a sudden plunge into water, followed by loud echoes. At the same moment there came a sound from above me, like a quick opening and closing of a door. A faint gleam of light flashed suddenly through the gloom and faded away just as suddenly. I saw clearly the doom that had been prepared for me, and congratulated myself upon the accidents that had helped me escape it. Just one more step before my fall, and the world would have seen me no more. The Inquisition reserves two kinds of punishment for its hopeless victims: death preceded by physical torture, or death preceded by mental torture. I had been sentenced to the latter. In my long suffering, I had grown more and more nervous until I trembled at the sound of my own voice. I was an excellent candidate for the torment that I now had to suffer through. Shaking in every limb, I groped my way back to the wall, determined to die there rather than risk the terrors of that deep well. In other states of mind, I might have had the courage to end my misery at once by leaping into the pits, but just then I was a coward. I could not forget what I had read about these pits. The falling into them was only the beginning of the torture. My agitated spirit kept me awake for many hours. Finally, I slept again. Upon waking, I found by my side, as before, a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water. My burning thirst consumed me, and I emptied the pitcher at once. It must have been drugged, for scarcely had I drunk before I became irresistibly drowsy. I fell into a deep sleep, like that of death. When I woke once again, I was able to see objects around me for the first time, in a wild, sulphurous light whose source I could not pinpoint, enabled me to see everything inside my cell. I had been wrong about its size. The whole way around the walls was no more than 25 yards. How could it be so much smaller than I'd thought? For some minutes this fact bothered me in a trivial way. Trivial indeed, for what could be less important under these terrible conditions than the size of my dungeon? Looking around me, I saw that the general shape of the prison was square. Along the walls were hideous and repulsive devices of metal in the shape of fiends, skeletons, and other deathly images. I noticed that the outlines of these monstrosities were distinct. but their color seemed faded and blurred. I now noticed the floor, too, which was stone. In the center yawned the circular pit from whose jaws I had barely escaped. All of this I saw indistinctly and by much effort, for my condition had greatly changed while I slept. I now lay on my back, at full length, on a low bed of wood. To this I was securely bound by a long strap, passed about my limbs and my body. I could move only my head and my left arm. My arm was tied so that I could only reach some chunks of meat in an earthen dish on the floor, and with great efforts bring the food to my mouth. I saw, to my horror, that the pitcher had been taken away. I say to my horror because I was consumed by an intolerable thirst. This must have been the goal of those who were torturing me, because the food in the dish was very spicy, making me even more thirsty. Looking upward, I surveyed the ceiling of my prison. It was some 30 to 40 feet overhead, and constructed much the same way as the side walls. In one of the panels, an unusual figure captured my whole attention. It was a painted figure of Father Time. He held what appeared to be the picture image of a huge pendulum, like the ones we see on clocks. While I gazed directly upward, I thought I saw the pendulum in motion. It moved briefly and slightly, but it definitely moved. I watched it for several minutes, somewhat in fear, but more in wonder. I was growing weary of this dull moments when a slight noise drew my attention to the floor. There, I saw several enormous rats coming up from the pits, which lay just within view to my left. While I watched, they came up and hurriedly, with hungry eyes, lured by the scent of meat. It took me much effort to scare them away. It may have been half an hour, maybe an hour, before I looked again upward. What I saw then amazed me. The sweep of the pendulum had increased in width by nearly a yard. Its speed was also much greater. What mainly disturbed me was the realization that it had moved lower. I now observed with terror that the pendulum was a huge razor made of glittering steel. It swung from a huge rod of brass, and the whole thing hissed as it swept back and forth through the air. I could no longer doubt the doom prepared for me. I knew that surprise or torment was an important part of the dungeon death. I had avoided plunging into the pit by the merest of accidents. Having failed to fall, I would not be simply thrown in. The Inquisition had other, crueler ways to see me off. Why bother telling you what of the long, long hours of horror during which I counted the rushing vibrations of the steel, inch by inch, line by line, with the descent barely noticeable. At times it seemed ages down, and still down it came. Days passed, perhaps even many days, before it swept so closely over me that it fanned me with its deadly breath. The odor of sharp steel forced itself into my nostrils. I prayed, wore out heaven with my prayers for the blade to move faster. I grew frantically mad and struggled to force myself upward against the sweep of the fearful blade. Then I suddenly felt calm and lay smiling at the glittering death the way a child looks at some rare toy. I passed out again, only briefly. I thought it might have been a long time, however, for upon waking I noticed no movement in the pendulum. I knew that there were demons who had taken note of my passing out. They could have slowed the blade's descent until they knew I was watching it again. When I came to, I felt sick and weak. Even amid the agonies of that period, I craved food. With painful effort, I outstretched my left arm as far as my bonds permitted. I took hold of the small bits of meat the rats had left behind. As I put a portion of it to my lips, there rushed to my mind a half-formed thought of joy, of hope. The pendulum swings back and forth across my chest, right over my heart. Despite its terrifically wide sweep, some 20 feet or more, and the hissing cruelty of its descent, it would make several minutes just to cut through my clothes. I forced myself to think about how the blade would sound as it passes across the garment, upon the peculiar throwing sensation of the friction of cloth produces on my nerves. I thought about this all the way until my teeth were on edge. I alternately laughed and howled as I considered its ruthless power. Down, relentlessly down, the blade vibrated within 3 inches of my chest. I struggled violently, furiously, to free my left arm. This was only free from the elbow to the hand, as I had said. I could reach my hand from the bowl beside me to my mouth only with great efforts. If I could have broken the fastenings above the elbow, I might have tried to grab the pendulum and force it to stop. It might as well have tried to stop an avalanche. Down it came. I gasped and shuddered at each vibration. I shrunk lower at its every sweep. I saw that some 10 or 12 sweeps would bring the steel in contact with my robe, and there suddenly came over my spirit all the keen, collected calmness of despair. For the first time during many hours, or perhaps days, I thought clearly. It occurred to me that the strap was bound to me, was the only thing that held me to the wooden bed. The first stroke of the razor across any portion of the strap would let me unwind it, but how fearfully near the steel would have to be by that time. How deadly the slightest struggle. Besides, wasn't it likely that the Inquisitors had foreseen this possibility? Was it likely that the strap across my chest was directly in the track of the pendulum? Afraid to find my last faint hope frustrated, I raised my head as far as possible to look at my chest. The strap crossed my limbs and body in all directions, except for the path of the pendulum. I could not count on the steel to free me this day. Scarcely had I dropped my head back to its original position when there flashed upon my mind an unformed, dim idea of deliverance. I proceeded at once, with the nervous energy of despair, and tried to carry it out. For many hours, the area around my wooden bed had been swarming with rats. They were wild, bold, and hungry. Their red eyes glared upon me as if they waited for motionless on my part to make me their prey. What food, I thought, have they been used to getting in this prison? Despite my best efforts, they had devoured all but a small portion of the meat, and I tried to brush them away with my free hand, but the fierce vermin fastened their sharp fangs into my fingers. The only particles of the oily meat chunks remained, but I rubbed them wherever I could on the strap holding me to the bed. Then, raising my hand from the floor, I lay breathlessly still. At first, the ravenous animals were startled and terrified by my movements. They shrunk back in alarm. Many went back into the well, but only for a moment. Their fierce appetite served me well. Noticing that I had remained without motion, 1 or 2 of the boldest rats leaped onto my chest and sniffed the strap. This seemed to be a signal for the general invasion. Out of the pit they scurried. They crawled over me by the hundreds. A measured movement of the pendulum disturbed them not at all. Avoiding its strokes, they busied themselves chewing on the greasy strap. They pressed, they swarmed upon me in ever-growing heaps. They writhed upon my throat, their cold lips sought my own. I was half stifled by their thronging pressure. A disgust for which the world has no name swelled in my bosom and chilled my heart with a heavy clamminess. Yet in one minute I felt that the struggle would be over. I could feel the strap getting looser. I knew that it must already be chewed through in one or more places. With more than human willpower, I lay still. My endurance was rewarded. At last the strap was free. The strap had been chewed to pieces, and by the stroke of the pendulum had already pressed upon my chest through my robe. Twice it swung, and sharp pain through every nerve. The moment of escape had arrived, and waving my hand, the rats hurried away. With a steady movement, cautious and sidelong, shrinking and slow, I slid out of the embrace of the strap and beyond the reach of the blade. For the moment, I was free. Free, but still in the grip of the Inquisition. I had scarcely stepped from my wooden bed of horror when the horrible machine stopped. I saw it being pulled back up to the ceiling by some invisible force. It was a lesson that I took desperately to heart. My every motion was certainly being watched. Free, but had I escaped death in one form of agony to be delivered into worse than death in some other? With that thought, I rolled my eyes nervously around, looking at the iron barriers that hemmed me in. Something unusual, some change that I could not grasp at first, had taken place in the room. I fell into many minutes of dreamy and trembling trance of uselessness, unconnected thoughts. During this period, I became aware, for the first time, where my sulphurous light with my cell was coming from. It came from a crack about half an inch wide that extended around my prison at the base of the walls. I knelt down and tried to look through that crack, but to no avail. As I arose from another attempt, I finally could see that the fresh eyes had changed the chamber being. I finally could see with fresh eyes how the chamber was being changed. The metal figurines lining the wall were glowing fiendishly from an intense heat that they gave off. Demon eyes, wild and ghastly, glared upon me in 1,000 directions, where none had been visible before. Unreal, even while I breathed, and the smell of heated iron came to my nostrils. A suffocating odor swept throughout my prison. A deeper glow settled. Each moment in the eyes that glared agonies. I panted. I gasped for breath. There could be no doubt of the design of the tormentors. Oh, most unrelenting and demonic of men. I shrank from my glowing metal back to the center of the cell. It's my thoughts of fiery destruction. The idea of a cool well came over my cell with a healing ointment. I rushed to the pit's deadly brink and looked below. The glare from the red-hot room lit every inch of the pit. Yet I could not find the courage to jump. With a shriek, I rushed away from the edge and buried my face in my hands, weeping bitterly. The heat increased rapidly, and some again I looked up, shuddering. There had been a second change in the cell. 2 of its walls had begun to move toward me in a slow, rumbling sound. I could have collapsed on the red walls to my chest and as a garment for eternal peace. Death, I said, any death but that of the pit. There was a pit, however, that I was being slowly pushed towards. The room grew flatter and flatter as the walls moved in with a speed that left me no time to think. I shrank away, but the unstoppable walls kept pressing me back toward the pit. At length, I buried and writhed body had not been an inch of foothold on the firm prison floor. Alliteration. I struggled no more, but the agony of my soul found vent in one loud, long, and final scream of despair. I tottered at the brink of the pit. Suddenly I heard shouts and screams outside the cell. There was the loud blast of many trumpets. There was the hard pounding sound of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back, away from me. Even so, I could stay conscious no longer, fainting. I just began to fall into the abyss. Just in time, an outreached arm caught me. It was General Lasalle. The French army had taken the city. I was free, and the Spanish Inquisition was in the hands of the enemies. Alright, well, my cubs. Again, this was the last story in this book, The Wonderful Tales of Terror and Suspense. It is an illustrated version, Young Collector's Illustrated Classics with Edgar Allan Poe, done by Masterwork Books, a division of kids' books. I can't begin to tell you how long I've had this book, so I probably won't even try. But again, this was the last story in this book. If you have any suggestions, by all means, leave me a comment. Not that any of you have been leaving comments, or much less listening to me telling my stories. I do have another book I might read from, or I may completely switch things around and try singing. I don't sing that well. You can look at my other things to find that out. But I do have a picture prepared when I do sing. But as it is, dear cubs, it is late, and you really should be in bed by now. Had you been in bed when we started, chances are you might be asleep. Chances are you might not be. But again, cubs, I will tell you good night and wish you pleasant dreams. So, good night, my cubs. Pleasant dreams.